Well, a very good morning to you. It's bright and early, Mombasa Rogers, and it's a pleasure to have you with us right here on Morning Prime. Welcome to today's edition, where we'll be taking a look at the latest stories making headlines today, what has been covered in the papers, in the dailies, even as we interrogate various developments that are playing out in the governance field, equally in matters economy. Once again, it's a pleasure to have you with us on this 7th day of December 2023. How time flies. Some say it's already the season, and I'm sure you're enjoying your December wherever you are. So welcome to the broadcast. Just to start with an inspiring morning quote: "The silence in the morning holds a lot of expectations and is more hopeful than the silence at night." So wherever you are, as you get to kickstart your day in style, I wish you all the best. But do join us for the 3 hours as we get to interrogate some of the top stories that are covered on today's dailies. We'll be interrogating Kenya's bold newspaper, The Standard, The Daily Nation, The Business Daily, The East African, The People Daily, and for the Swahili readers, Taifa Leo will equally take a look at what has been encompassed on that particular beat. I'll get to introduce my guests in just but a few, but right now I want to take you through the latest that has been covered on today's edition of the dailies. I'll start with Kenya's bold newspaper, The Standard, so you can get to find out what has been put on the front page, the top story of the day on Kenya's bold newspaper. And it's all to do with the proposed changes at the floor of the House. The big story of the day: Ruto amasses power. That's the headline on The Standard, as you can see on your screens right there. All to do with that particular bill, as I mentioned, that is on the floor of the House. We'll definitely get to interrogate it in totality. But that's the big story of the day, what The Standard is going big with. Ruto amasses power, center of influence. Chief of Staff Felix Kosgei to wield unparalleled authority should a bill to Parliament sail through. The President wants his Mr. Fix-It to, among other things, be the custodian of the government seal domiciled at the Attorney General's office. So proposed changes right there. We'll get to interrogate that in totality a little bit later on. But on the national page 10, as you can see, the Cabinet Secretary for Treasury had a bombshell yesterday as he was facing the parliamentary committee. He said, "We have no money for CDF or salaries." So it's safe to say the government is broke, definitely struggling. And just this week, we saw members of Parliament stage a walkout due to issues around the National Government Constituency Development Fund, CDF, which hasn't been released. They cite it might hamper the education system down at the constituencies, as many learners depend on the constituency development funds. That's one of the stories we'll take a look at. Equally, listen to what the Cabinet Secretary had to say on that particular regard. On the national page 3, crisis of 54 pregnancies in one school. Definitely worrying right there, bearing in mind schools have closed for the December holidays. And this statistics is a dent in the fight against teenage pregnancy in the country. But find more details on page 3 about that crisis of 54 pregnancies in one school. On the wall pages 24, Mandela memories 10 years later, as they remember Madiba. You can definitely interrogate that story on the wall pages right here on Kenya's bold newspaper, The Standard. For the sports fans, you're definitely covered. Arsenal kings of last-minute wins. As Arsenal fans say, it's definitely cold at the top of the table. They're definitely enjoying that. Away from sports to the national pages 8 and 9 of Kenya's bold newspaper, The Standard. This is what you can expect. Kenya to lead food initiative in Commonwealth, where Kenya has been picked to spearhead climate resilient agriculture for food security across the 56 Commonwealth countries. Pages 8 and 9 have more details on that, on how Kenya is set to benefit and lead the rest of the region in this particular venture, all to do with the food initiative. One of the big stories of the day, all to do with the Azimio leader Raila Odinga spilling the beans and uncovering what he says are tendering wars at the ministry. And he says they're behind the KCPE errors, where the opposition leader has joined calls for a review of this year's primary school final examinations, saying the results are not a true reflection of the test. Remember, some education institutions have gone to court to challenge the results. Definitely a cause of concern, taking a look at the credibility of our examinations right there. But are we digging where there's no story? That's one of the questions we'll be raising to the panelists. Or where there's smoke, there's definitely fire. More details to follow, even as we'll run a story on how the members of parliament, the education committee, is equally looking at this particular KCPE and the results thereafter. So that's what you can expect on today's edition of The Standard. But still on that story, Raila claims grades in science, social studies and religious studies were truncated. The rollout, so KCPE candidates get graded in subjects they've never sat for. That was a case in point in Kenya Sign Language, where we had a couple of complaints. But NEC later on went on to change a couple of results, and more details are on pages 6 and 7 of The Standard. Even as you take a look at some of the KCPE stats, 1,415,911 registered candidates sat for the KCPE exam. The highest mark was 428. And Raila claims the system deployed could not produce the plus and minus signs. So that's what you can expect on today's edition of The Standard. Make sure you grab yourself a copy. Allow us to shift focus to what has been highlighted on the Daily Nation today. This is what you can expect on the front page. The return of CASs. A new government-sponsored bill is seeking to anchor the position of Chief Administrative Secretary-in-Law as President William Ruto's Kenya Kwanza administration moves to align with a High Court ruling that found the Assistant Minister post unconstitutional. This will pave way for the appointment of 50 Chief Administrative Secretaries, escalating the public wage bill and weighing down an already overburdened Kenyan taxpayer. So that bill, introduced on the floor of the House by Majority Leader Kimani Ichung'wah, if it sails through, will definitely see a return of the CASs. But this bill coming at a time when we are grappling as a country with a huge wage bill, the public wage bill weighing down on the already overburdened Kenyan taxpayer. It will be a cause of concern, even as the law is aligned to accommodate that particular post, the Chief Administrative Secretaries. On page 7 of the Daily Nation, Raila claims tender war behind exams mess as Machogu defends results. We'll get to hear from the Cabinet Secretary of Education what he had to say, but more details on page 7. What Raila Odinga has unearthed as he spills the beans, all to do with this year's Kenya Certificate of Primary Examinations. Good news for TikTok content creators. Our subscription model is set to be launched in Kenya. So they might be smiling all the way to the bank in just a few months if all goes well. Find out more details on page 2 of the Daily Nation. We have more details on one of the major stories that has made the headlines in the past few days. Allow me to just zoom in right there so we can get a snippet of what has been covered on page 5 of the Daily Nation, and we'll get to interrogate this with my panelists. MPs divided over Nyakango charges, where this week we saw the Controller of Budget head to a Mombasa court where she pleaded not guilty to various charges, including fraud, all to do with a particular circle. She says she left once she assumed the position of controller of budget. But while the opposition accused the state of targeting the controller of budget over her strong stance against misuse of public funds, the government side said she's subject to the law like any other person. Just yesterday, debate on the floor of the House, the leader of the majority mentioning that despite being a state officer and a holder of an independent office, she is subject to the law like any other person. The opposition benches were not too happy with this, even as some members of parliament from the Kisii community came up in arms, mentioning Mtuwetu is being targeted. But at the end of the day, is this all to do with her strong stance against misuse of public funds? Remember, as she appeared at the National Dialogue Committee, she had revelations into how we are budgeting corruption. Case in point, her salary had been budgeted 3 times over, a cause of concern. Mind you, she was not the only state officer, according to her, that such is happening when it comes to over budgeting of salaries. But more details on that particular story, we'll get to interrogate that in totality with my panelists, get their view on it. And we definitely understand that it's a case in court. We can't expound on it in totality. But since it's in the public domain and members of parliament are commenting on it, we'll definitely try and take a look at what this means, perhaps in terms of the gatekeepers, because when she was forwarded for this particular position, she was vetted by Parliament. And is that an indictment to Parliament? Well, we'll get to take a look at that particular story. But page 5 has more details on the control of budget wars and the stories that are developing around that particular beat. To the return of CASs and other stories covered on the Daily Nation, you can expect this in terms of details around the edible oil scandal. And I just want to perhaps get more details right there on what has been covered on the condemned cooking oil. The big question is, what exactly is happening at KEBS? At first, Kenyans got news that the edible oil is not fit for consumption, but now the Kenya Bureau of Standards yesterday clarified that the edible oil imported by the Kenya National Trading Corporation is safe for consumption. KEBS said the imported edible oil had been sampled, re-inspected and tested and found to have met all the safety standards. The back page of the Daily Nation has more details on that. Make sure you grab yourself a copy and interrogate that particular story. That's definitely a cause of concern for consumers all across the country, because KEBS bases its argument on scientific results. So when we see them a little bit wishy-washy when it comes to such issues that are delicate to the Kenyan consumer, it's a cause of concern, and it's definitely raised eyebrows, even as the state's trading agency officials have been questioned over that foodstuff import deal. Remember, earlier on we saw KNTC officials questioned by the DCI, all to do with the importation of the edible oils. Heads haven't rolled yet, but it seems to be in the offing. A lot to do with that particular cooking oil consignment. More details on the back page. And we have a splash right there. The ex-bank boss wanted a hitman to kill his wife in US. Dr. Leonard Thuo Mwithiga, who's 52, had a high-flying career at Kenya Commercial Bank, KCB, where he worked as the Group Shared Services Director. A man of few words, he was a calm corporate fixer. Friends and former colleagues told Nation. But beneath the veneer, he had a killer mind. He flew to the US less than 3 months ago looking for a hitman to kill his wife, with whom they had falling out, only for the killer to leak the motive to the police. Page 3 has more details on that. On the technology pages, page 24, hackers go after state academia in wave of attacks, where hackers descended heavily on web and mobile applications targeting the government, academia, and end users of phone apps in 3 months to September. Page 24, as I mentioned, has more details on that particular beat. But that's the latest on the front page of the Daily Nation. Just a hint of what you can expect on today's dailies. Let's shift focus to the Business Daily right now. Take a look at what has been covered on the economy and business aspect. The top story of the day seems to echo the message that perhaps we're damned if we do, damned if we don't. Kenyans on 100,000 shillings pay grow slowest in 5 years. That's according to the latest data from the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics that shows salaried workers who take home more than 100,000 sort of increased by 13,131 or 3.7% last year. This was the slowest growth since 2018, when the revised data on wage employment is publicly available. So, number of Kenyans earning more than 100,000 monthly has grown at the slowest pace in at least 5 years. A sign showing the tough times we're in terms of the state of the economy. And we'll get to hear from the Cabinet Secretary of Treasury yesterday what he had to say, as he mentioned they're struggling with salaries, let alone the National Government Constituency Development Fund. Two other stories covered on the Business Daily today. Equity boss defends buying land from Moi. You can find more details on page 2 on how James Mwangi has told the High Court that he bought a 20-acre piece of land from the late Daniel Arap Moi for 300 million shillings in February 2012. One of the stories covered on the Business Daily, how new 7 million shillings per year UK migration rule will hit you, where Kenyans planning to migrate to the UK and bring their families along may have to adjust their plans or dig deeper into their pockets to qualify. The immigration rule, definitely a cause of concern, where you have to be making 7 million per year if you want to migrate to the UK and bring your family with you. Page 4 has more details. Poster declares all senior posts vacant, where the Postal Corporation of Kenya has declared redundant all senior manager positions at the state corporation in the ongoing staff restructuring that seeks to cut costs amid dwindling revenues. Car buyer rush to beat 8-year import regulation. Page 14, details on car dealers and buyers on how they're rushing to beat the December 31st cutoff date for units assembled 8 years ago. A lot happening in the business world. 3 companies drop NSE listing, plans on bear run. That's on the capital markets. More details on page 2 of the Business Daily. But that's the big story. Splashed on the Business Daily, Kenyans on 100,000 pay grow slowest in 5 years. Let's shift focus to the Taifa Leo for the Swahili consumers. This is what you can expect on the front page of the Taifa Leo. The big story of the day, Raila afichua kashfa KCPE. Raila Odinga ataka jopo libuniwe kuangazia dosari baada ya malalamishi kuhusu mtihani. Find out more details on what Raila claims as tender wars to be behind the exams mess, this even as the Cabinet Secretary for Education, Ezekiel Machogu, defended the results of this year's KCPE examinations. Apart from that, ODM yakosoa serikali kuhusu mgao wake. ODM yashutumu Kenya Kwanza kwa kupunguza pesa za vyama vya kisiasa kwa hadi shilingi milioni 400 22 ili kulemaza upinzani. Ukurasa wa 3 na maelezo zaidi. Make sure you grab yourself a copy. Mafuta KEBS yatoa ushauri wa kutatanisha. Imepiga abautani na kusema mafuta ya kupikia ya KNTC ni salama. Ukurasa wa 2 una maelezo zaidi. All to do with that kashfa, quote unquote, on the oil consignment on edible oils. TikTok sasa kulipisha watumiaji. Hata wabunge wa Kisii watetea Nyakango. Ukurasa wa 10 una maelezo zaidi, ambavyo vile viongozi hawa waapa kumtetea kisheria, wakisema kuwepo kwa njama ya kisiasa. So is there a political motive behind her recent wars, bearing in mind what she had to say about budgeted corruption? So that's in Taifa Leo. Make sure you grab yourself a copy. Let's just take a look at what's happening regionally in the East African. This is what you can expect in the weekly edition. Kir's full plate at home, all to do with the East African community. With the general election, conflict and struggling economy, will the Juba leader have time to deal with regional security and trade disputes? Well, he has a lot on his plate at home and in the region. Page 4 has more details on the man at the helm. Critical moment for climate action. A lot happening to do with COP28 in Dubai. Well, President William Ruto was there a little bit earlier on, and he spoke at the high-level segment for heads of state and government session, where world leaders took center stage at the talks under pressure to step up efforts to limit global warming. More details on the call for climate action, even as our camera lenses are trained in Dubai following the COP28 summit. Why Ruto's cheap houses plan ran into headwinds. Page 5 has details on how developers say the high interest rate regime makes it difficult to raise capital as government continues to tax workers. Pages 8 and 9, IGAD calls summit on Sudan peace. The bloc has organized a meeting of heads of state in Djibouti on December 9th to help combatants return to the mediation table. So that's what's happening regionally in terms of what's covered on the East African. More details, of course, but make sure you grab yourself a copy, just perusing through some of the top stories covered on the front page. Allow us to shift focus to the People Daily. Real quick and fast, interrogating what has been covered on the front page. And that's what you can expect. There's no money for CDF or the roads. There's no money for CDF roads, where Treasury CS put to task over the late release of funds for bursaries, as his roads counterpart says he can't pay for new infrastructure. That's during the CS time on the floor of the House. The Cabinet Secretary for Transport, Kipchumba Murkomen, was put to task to explain the rollout of the infrastructure roads, the roads infrastructure in the country. And he definitely defended himself, mentioning he has no autonomy in terms of planning the budget, where the House has the sole authority when it comes to budget matters. And this reflects on the infrastructure developments that have been focused on by the Kenya Kwanza administration. But the big story of the day is all to do with what the Cabinet Secretary for Treasury had to say yesterday, where he fell short of saying the government is broke. As simple as that. We have a couple of statistics right there. What each of the 290 constituencies get for NGCDF: 130 million. They are owed about 37.7 billion Kenya shillings. 23 billion is what oil marketers have been paid for from 66 billion pending bills. Balance is in bonds, 155 billion pending bills for roads, according to Murkomen, who was allocated only a paltry 46 billion. So compare that with the pending bills figure, 155 billion. It's definitely a catch-22 scenario. But that's the latest on the front page of the People Daily. On page 16, banks feel pressure as bad loans keep rising. 8 of the top 10 lenders have recorded increasing defaults, with only 2 define the trend. So banks are equally hard hit. Find out which ones have improved, which ones are hard hit. More details on page 16 right there. Even as the Treasury Cabinet Secretary is quoted saying, "We are struggling just to be in the same place. We are facing a serious liquidity crisis, but not a solvency issue. If we push it further, we could end up putting in place measures that could ignite solvency problems." So what we have right now is a liquidity crisis, not a solvency issue. Good thing we have an economist on our panel. We'll get to interrogate what that means for you as a taxpayer. But that's the latest on the People Daily. Shifting focus to Daily Monitor, let's see what our neighbors are all about in terms of news making headlines. How plot to overthrow government was uncovered. The investigations over the past 2 months established that in the first week of October, military spies picked intelligence that the army had been infiltrated and some officers paid to recruit peers or conduct espionage. Page 4 has more details. That's the latest in Uganda. Kiambogo graduates over 10,000. Story on page 6. Government relaxes age for HIV self-test kit users to 17, where it's progress, quote unquote. According to that particular article, the Ministry of Health has announced that it has relaxed the age at which people are allowed to access the testing tool as part of efforts to curb HIV. We just marked the World HIV Day the other day. And that's progress in Uganda. Museveni gives city bus deal to tycoon Katabazi. Page 5 has more details on that. That's what's happening in Uganda, at least according to what has been covered on the Daily Monitor. On the Citizen, last but definitely not least, a ray of hope at last. That's a big story of the day, where Katesh and Gendabi, the 2 townships that bore the brunt of last Saturday's deadly mudslide and flash floods in Hanang district, began showing early signs of recovery yesterday as some businesses reopened and a major cleanup operation was underway. Remember, at least 69 people have been killed in the flash floods and mudslide that occurred recently in Tanzania. One life is too many. Of course, we heard from Tanzania President Samia Suluhu as she shared a message of condolence live from Dubai earlier on in the week while she was attending the COP28 summit. But that's the latest from that catastrophe that happened in Tanzania. You can find more details on page 2. Why key international agency needs more cash now than ever, where persistent global headwinds mean that the International Development Association needs more funds to boost support for vulnerable countries. Page 2 has more details, even as Forbes names Samia Suluhu Africa's second most powerful woman. Story on page 3, a pat on the back for the president in terms of that particular listing. US entrepreneur shares why he chose Tanzania, page 11 right there, even as there's more details on the latest in the world of football. Those are today's dailies, so make sure you grab yourself a copy of the local daily so you're adequately informed about what's transpiring in the country. Allow me to introduce my guests who are joining me in studio. And of course, I'd like to start with Professor Gituro Enaina, who's sort of welcoming us to the show. He's a regular on the panel. And today we have new faces on the panel, including the host as well. So, Professor Gituro Wainaina, thank you for welcoming us. Karibu sana.
Thank you. I see a lot of greenhorns, but you're welcome, guys. We all start somewhere.
Yeah.
Good to see you, Jesse, for some time. Yeah,
it's good to see you as well, Prof. Karibu sana. A lot happening in the world of economy, and we'll definitely need your input as we try and interrogate those headlines. Right. So, Prof, asante sana for your time. Is from the School of Business at the University of Nairobi. Equally joined by Kevin Osido, a governance expert, the Executive Director at County Governance Watch. Osido, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Good morning.
Good morning to you, sir.
I hope your week is going well.
Not bad.
It is the season.
Precisely. And taking charge where you can.
Okay.
When necessary.
Karibu sana. It's great to have you with us. Equally joined by Mark Bichachi, communication strategist. Where do I start? It's been good to it's good to see you. It's good to have you here. And we're waiting for your analysis on matters to do with Kenya.
Asante, I'm looking for my greenhorn.
Friendly fire, as they say. Anyway, Mark Bichachi, karibu sana. Suleiman Bashir equally joins us. He's the legal head in the panel. He's a lawyer. It's great to have you, Wakili. Karibu sana to the show. I hope you have a fantastic morning.
Asante, Jesse.
Karibu sana. Well, so gentlemen, I'd like us to perhaps begin with the top story on Kenya's bold newspaper, The Standard, all to do with a move on the floor of the House in Parliament that might see the return of CASs. The Standard has gone big with Ruto amasses power, all to do with center of influence, where the Chief of Staff Felix Kosgei is said to wield unparalleled authority should a bill to Parliament sail through. The President wants his Mr. Fix-It, to, among other things, be the custodian of the government seal domiciled at the Attorney General's office. That's what the Standard has gone big with, but it's equally conjoined with what the top story on the Daily Nation is all about, the return of chief administrative secretaries, where that government-sponsored bill is seeking to anchor the position of chief administrative secretaries in law as President William Ruto's Kenya Kwanza administration moves to align with the High Court ruling that found the assistant minister post unconstitutional. This will pave way for the appointment of 50 chief administrative secretaries, escalating the public wage bill and weighing down an already overburdened Kenyan taxpayer. Wakili, it would be proper to start with you because we recall just recently, I think it was last year, that move by the courts to declare the chief administrative secretary post unconstitutional. Well, right now, they're approaching it in the proper legal manner, trying to align with that particular High Court ruling. In terms of the legalese, what do you make of this particular move, even as you interrogate what it means for the public wage bill, briefly?
Thank you, Jesse. I think this follows following an outcome that was done by the court sometime in July last year, whereby the court has rendered it unconstitutional for several reasons. But the situation we are finding ourselves in is a scenario whereby the state seeks to move an amendment through the National Government Coordination Act to try and introduce certain offices. And I think this particular bill, the National Government Administration Bill, is a bill that has a lot of amendments. It seeks to introduce amendments across various cross-cutting laws. Part of the reasons that the High Court in the previous year has issued was the question of lack of parliamentary approval. One of the ways of now appreciating that is through introducing a bill whereby the essence of it is to even ultimately give the people of Kenya an opportunity to participate at the public participation level. So for us, I will say, the government has had a look at it has filed an appeal at the Court of Appeal, but it realized that according to the judgment that was rendered by the High Court, it was bold, it was very reasonable. And that is why now it is trying to think back, go back to what it can do in terms of seeking to introduce such a bill. The question of whether or not the members will pass it is a different ballgame altogether. But in terms of introducing a state office using such a bill is an issue that we are looking at in terms of how he's going to streamline the functions of the CSS vis-a-vis those of cabinet secretaries and the principal secretary. Because for us, at the moment, this is a strange body. It is not anchored on any law. For now, it will be a stepping stone in terms of now trying to legalize the same. The question of whether or not it will pass a different story altogether, but this is a bill that, if passed, it will end up giving it some semblance of legalization. That's what I will say.
Okay. Bichachi, many might question the timing of this particular bill, bearing in mind we just heard from the Cabinet Secretary of Treasury yesterday. The government is struggling with salaries, let alone the National Government Constituency Development Fund payments. So when you see such a move to perhaps increase the public wage bill right now, what say you, apart from the legalese here?
Well, it's a catch-22, isn't it? Because, number one, the government will argue that the position of CIS is necessary. It's necessary because it will help CSS work better, it will help PSS work better. Now, whether that was true for Uhuru Kenyatta or not is a matter that is up for debate. But can Kenya afford to increase its wage bill at such a high level? Right now, no. And not just in terms of the lack of money, in terms also of where the people of Kenya are. People of Kenya are at a place where they're feeling the pain of the shilling every time they go to a shop, every time they go to the supermarket. They're feeling the pain in their salaries in terms of being taxed extra. So it is also not just about the money, it's also about the public sentiment and where the public feels this country is at. So it's questionable that it's being done now, but also there has to be a dividend for the Kenyan public, that this is not just another opportunity for jobs for the boys and girls, but it is also an opportunity to advance good governance in this country. And that's the case the government really has to make. They have to convince us that if they get the CSs they want, and I hope they are not going to be 53, was it? I hope it's not going to hit that number, that they are actually going to deliver for Kenyans. But given how political office goes in this country, it hardly pays dividend for Kenyans. We will simply be getting more traffic because there will be more chase cars, more important people moving around without results.
Interesting way to look at it. So, anyway, if Osido, as you come in, just reading an extract from the particular story where it says, if passed, the CASs will be accountable to the Attorney General or Cabinet Secretaries according to the proposed legislation, emphasizing the gravity of their roles within the state structure. It's just deliberated on a particular point in terms of the governance improvement when the CSs come on board. From your point of view, is this a necessary pain for the Kenyan taxpayer, looking at the benefits we might have when it comes to the governance structure?
Thank you so much, Jesse. The pain is unnecessary. It is not worth it. I don't think it will improve any sort of governance or any leadership indicators that we have. Right. In fact, His Excellency the President has actually made us know while he was addressing his part of his top-level government officials, and he was raising a question about their knowledge of their tasks and roles. And he said, if to the extent that I know more than you do, then there is a problem. So the question could be easy. Is the president seeking to justify the unknowledge mechanisms and issues within cabinet and within government by bringing in cabinet administrative secretaries? Is there a bigger challenge or a huge gap that the president has noticed within his government that is trying to therefore fill in without necessarily having to fire PSS and CSS, that is sub-cabinet secretaries? Has the president and particularly the government delivery units monitored, and are they able to provide data on the value that the appointment of 50 because in fact part of the questions that the court had was that you advertised for 23, and so you are appointing 50. Why the additional 27? So I think there are going to be very many big questions. In fact, I have to really thank you, Jesse, because I was grappling with the not carrying my copy of the Constitution today, and thank you for ensuring that each of us has a copy on our tables. But this Constitution never envisioned the position of Cabinet Administrative Secretaries.
Chief Administrative.
And in fact, as you read that excerpt, what the government is seeking to do is to legalize through the back door an illegality, which is a constitutional illegality. And that is why, if you were to touch the structure of government, because you asked me a governance question, and you put this CSS within the executive, which is the office of the president, then that therefore calls for a referendum. And are Kenyans ready for a referendum, even as we seek to focus on this kind of concerns? So the fact of the matter, as the bill proposes that they would be reporting to the Attorney General, already circumvents certain bare limits of the Constitution. And I therefore think that in the event that this matter goes through the National Assembly, when it comes to public participation, Kenyans and citizens should be up and vigilant. Because already we are talking about a wage bill of about 970 billion shillings. And the introduction of Cabinet Administrative Secretaries is going to widen this gap by about 500 million annually. What does that mean to counties that are also grappling with delivery of services? What does that mean to different government ministries and departments, for instance, health, where we are still grappling with navigating negotiations with doctors, nurses over strikes and all that? What does that mean to teachers who are on the streets demonstrating just a few days ago over loss of payment of their salaries? What does it mean to examination markers who up to now are alleging that government has not been able to pay them? What does that mean to the roads across the country that are leading to markets, where anytime it rains, we see trucks of loads of goods that are supposed to be delivered on time in markets like milk, cabbages, tomatoes. So I think that there are many, many bigger questions that we need to ask ourselves before we begin to ask the political question whether the president is seeking to score politically by bringing in people who were failed by citizens into office through the introduction of either an amendment of a bill or just directly appointing some people to be Cabinet Administrative Secretaries. So from a governance perspective, it adds very little value. I don't think it will increase any sense of service delivery, and I don't think that is going to even make government performance any efficient.
Okay,
Thank
Prof,
you.
as you reflect perhaps on the governance aspect, because I'm reading here the bill does not cap the number of CAS positions that the president can appoint. So it needs a blank check for the appointment of chief administrative secretaries. On the economic side, we definitely grappling with a huge public wage bill. This does not make the situation any easier, especially when we're talking about 50 plus CS positions. It's all about striking a balance at the end of the day in terms of value for money and looking at the work output. So from your point of view, is this a necessity?
My perspective is not even balancing it. It's very straightforward. It's tilted to one direction, and I think Wakili was right there. And he put it so well. I'm not going to go into that. But let's perhaps focus on two things. Taking it to the National Assembly is no brainer. There were 40 years, majority. So it's really a waste of time. But reflecting from 2017 to 2022, when we had those fellas in the government and had the opportunity to interact with them, really their business was just opening meetings. Seriously, the CS would say, I'm busy, they send that person. In terms of value, there's none. And it's very worrying when Dongo here is saying we are struggling just to be in the same place. Imagine I'm struggling to start where I am. And he says we are facing serious liquidity crisis and not solvency issue. And he said if we push further, we could end up putting in place measures that could ignite solvency problems. To me, there is it. So you have on this page, and then here we're saying And he brought a very good point. I mean, as the position we are in this country, we are looking for funds for CDF. CDF goes to the last mile. CDF addresses the Mwananchi. We are looking for roads, as rightly pointed out. So this is the wrong time to have this kind of fellas on board. And to me, it's not you bring one or you bring 100. That's not the point. We don't need it. It's not necessary. It's not adding value. And the president needs to step back and listen to what the people are saying. It's so important to treat Kenyans with some level of intelligence instead of bulldozing things. And what we need in this country is really stepping back, address the issues facing us. Fuel, power, food, name it.
Simple.
So it's not even just an economical, it's the wrong thing to do at this moment.
Okay, as you come in, well, but I understand this case was appealed, it's still in the Court of Appeal, but even as, despite the court decision making the CAS as unconstitutional, we've definitely seen them attending government events, introducing the principal secretaries, as Professor said, the cabinet secretaries, and even other senior government positions, senior government officials, and it puts us in an awkward position in terms of the legalese. We cannot verify if they're earning a salary, whether they're getting money or not, you know, and other benefits. But what does this mean in terms of the rule of law in the country? Of course, they're going back to Parliament. As Prof says, it's just effort in futility. Itapita too, you know, at the end of the day. So what does it say about the law in general? Yeah,
it's on us.
It's fair to say that when you have a look at the case that was decided last year in July, the specific about 50 or so have been listed as interested parties in that case. So I had a look at some of the submissions that were filed in court. Part of the things that were submitted to the effect that they were never paid salaries since they have actually assumed office. That's part of the things that were submitted by the advocates. So I think it would be a bit fair to say at this stage that in as much as they are trying to be able to, to play certain functions in terms of the question of salaries, that has never been done to them. Actually, part of the issues that advocates were discussing is that in the event an appeal could have been successful, they could have an opportunity of even being paid a lump sum. So the question of a pay is neither here nor there at this stage. The other issue is when you look at again the roles that this particular amendment law is trying to introduce, they are trying to say that they'll be able to represent CSS at the Parliament in terms of responding to questions. They'll be able to assist CSS and PSS in a representative capacity in meetings and so forth. So that tells you there's no even crucial role that they're going to undertake in terms of going forth. Secondly, what may happen in terms of if this particular law is introduced in that house. This particular amendment law is not just even about this chief administrative secretaries. It's actually trying to even tinker with the functions of the Public Service Commission. Actually, certain functions are being given to the Attorney General. So I think this is the situation whereby we will call on the 13th House to wake up to a clearing call in terms of ensuring that if this bill comes to the floor of the House, let them show the people of Kenya that at least for once they care about the people. And this is actually the time to reject this particular amendment law. But as my colleagues have said, we have little expectation in terms of them arising to the occasion and saying, no, this is not the right time to pass this this particular bill. Jesse, I had an opportunity to even to work with some of them in the 11th Parliament. You'll be surprised that this is the morning that they are learning about this particular bill from the papers. They may not even have a clue of what goes on in that particular house, unfortunately.
Well, Bichachi, as you come in, remember earlier on when we had this whole conversation about chief administrative secretaries, those who are trying to justify the position were saying that perhaps it would be an entry point for the young and the bold, those who want to try their hand in, you know, government and all that. So at the end of the day, does that justify perhaps the position?
You know, that is to assume that when we are hiring chiefs, DCs and county officers, we hire old people. If you want to start learning government, there are very many positions in government you can start in. It is not always as chief administrative secretary. And a lot of the time, and I'll tell you as someone who sat on a board, I saw 26-year-olds being put at the heads of certain institutions. I can tell you without fear of contradiction, a year down the line, they still do not tell them the difference between their nose and their toes when they are going to the office. This idea that because you're young, you're entitled to positions, I think is ludicrous. Number two, to imagine that we have a parliament in this country is the biggest misnomer you can ever imagine. There's no parliament here to speak of. They do not oversight anything. They have no care for the Kenyan people. And if you doubt, tell me, when have they discussed the cost of living other than the time they increased it? They don't care. Right? And those who pretend to care only care when they are seated in seats like I am in, so that they can play to the public gallery. But when it comes to voting, where it matters, they are nowhere to be seen. When it comes to sitting on committees, you can only see their signature, not their caricature. So the fact is, there is no parliament. So this is a foregone conclusion. Thirdly, we must be very clear about where we are as a country. This country has revolving doors that are based on whose turn is it to eat. That's it. That's all these changes are about whose turn is it. Little of the changes that we see are about the people who pay for the eating. It is little about us. If you doubt me, look at the NADCO report. Look at how thin it is on matters, our food, our shelter. See how thick, detailed, and timelined it is when it's about their jobs.
Interesting. So, anyway, Osido, you had mentioned the role of public participation. So, is it an effort in futility? Now that it's in Parliament, we mentioned that the numbers will carry the day, of course, but what can we do in terms of public participation? But equally, this is not just about chief administrative secretaries. It wants to tinker with the power of the head of public service, an office currently held by Felix Koskei. Apart from supporting the president in facilitating organization and executing of government business, the officer shall be the administrative head of the executive office of the president and shall be the custodian of the public seal and any other instruments of state. My little knowledge tells me the Attorney General is currently the bearer of the seal. What does this mean? Perhaps we'll get to hear from the lawyer. What's your take on the other recommendations in this particular law?
Probably to start from the government seal or the public seal. Really, the Attorney General is a legal advisor to His Excellency the President. It's not the head of public service and chief of staff. Kenyans are not that stupid. At least we are well schooled. Some of us, most of us, we read for interest. And I think it would be much more stupid to say if we agreed and allowed some of these kind of amendments to pass. And as Bashir rightfully said, our parliamentarians do not care about anything. For them is about what's in it for me, for now. What am I getting out of this exercise? And for instance, we've been told in the past that envelopes, engulfing up to 3,000 shillings to the lowest, 500, have been passed to members of parliament, particularly the National Assembly, representatives, to pass certain bills. I don't think that is the kind of work that Kenyans give to them to do in that kind of, in the House. Yeah. We are looking for the terminologies such as an honorable member. What does this honor mean? When we say you are an honorable member of parliament, there is a certain bare minimum that we are looking for. And that bare minimum is to the extent that you'll be able to look at the law, what it says, and the actual implication. Because what it is implied, for instance, is that if I want to pick a marriage certificate, I have to go to State House. Where is the public seal? You know, where am I going to get the public seal? But if it is domiciled at the state law office or in the office of the Attorney General, there are over thousands of officers there. Therefore, I don't have to sit there for hours waiting for one single person, because we know that the Attorney General of the Republic of Kenya is one person, but works with very many people.
Right.
Who works with the head of public service? How many officers do we know that work in the office of the head of public service and chief of staff? I think there are certain things that President William Ruto should not allow to pass through, because people had certain expectations that he told us that he was going to exert so that we see that hope. Unfortunately, as it is, every amendment that this government is coming through and seeking to pass are things that are stifling, disenfranchising, and discouraging Kenyans every single day. I don't think we need to allow for some of these things to pass. And how do we do it? The question on public participation. Of course, by law, for any act, for any bills to be discussed or executed, they have to go through certain process. We call it the Kenyan lawmaking process. And within that process, after the first reading, introduction into the House, it goes to public participation before it goes back for the second reading or the second debate. Now, at that level is a level where Kenyans need to be as vigilant as is possibly possible, to be able now to be very vocal about some of these issues, and to also share research and information. And I don't think that, for instance, in this particular, for this particular government, we have not seen them being very keen, even for some of those exercises like public participation. Because, for instance, in the inaugural budget for this government, we saw Kenyans really giving red lights and knockouts and, yellow cards to many of the proposals that they had in the budget. And just out of nowhere, they thought that Kenyans just wasted their time to go and speak during the public participation processes. And they passed. And Bishashi has been talking about the NADCO report. Most of the recommendations that people made have not even seen their light into the report, as opposed to what Kenyans, as opposed to what the politicians are seeking to have. Yeah. So I believe that, yes, public participation is very critical, but we must not leave it up to the level, just up to the level of going, speaking, and submitting our petitions or our memoranda documents. We have to keep pushing it, and I have to be very grateful to Senator Okiya Omtata. We want to see as many Okiyas coming up now to be able to even challenge the courts, also to speak on behalf of Kenyans, and to be as vigilant and to be as astute and to be as deliberate, to be able to stop government from excesses, impunity, and things that are of zero benefit to the Kenyan people.
All right. Allow us to take a short break. We'll be back with the Prof's sentiments on not just that story, but what the Cabinet Secretary for Treasury had to say